I've known since I was 14 that there were things that that I thought were normal and that were okay that nobody else seems to think are normal and okay. So that's when I just started being a loner, I guess.
Israel Keys had no remorse at all. He enjoyed what he did. He talked about enjoying what he did. He talked about, had he not been caught, some of his future plans and what he would have done, which included continuing to do what he was doing, continuing to kidnap and murder people. So he had no remorse at all.
Israel Keys, the ex-military serial killer, bank robber, arsonist, terrorist, rapist, necrophiliac, lover of wild and mild cigars, coffee, and peanut butter Snickers candy bars.
Oh, the lawyers got you this. The lawyers.
The FBI called him a true ambush predator. They'd never seen anything like him. So grab a snack and let's dig in.
These are really good.
Israel Keys has been dubbed the most meticulous serial killer of the 21st century. Also, the traveling serial killer. I like to call him the kill kit killer. Keys has a body count of 11 plus people, 3 of whom he himself confessed to killing, and 1 of whom the FBI is very sure is a victim of Israel Keys. The rest of his victims are highly controversial, and most of them we may never know. After Israel's death, paintings were found under his bed. Paintings that he used his own blood to make. There were 12 individual sheets of paper. 11 of these had skulls painted on them, and the 12th had a satanic Baphomet pentagram on it. It's assumed that the 11 skulls represent his victims, and the 12th image represents himself and taking his own life. Regardless, the FBI has kept a tight seal on this case. It was only after Maureen Callahan, author of American Predator, sued for access to some of the files that a few thousand were released to her, leaving 45,000 documents still withheld. So, who is this jerk off?
Israel Keys is the second of 10 children.
He was born on the 7th of January 1978 in Cove, Utah to Heidi Hackinson and John Jeffrey Keys. His parents were both from Los Angeles, they were both Mormon, and they were both very suspicious of the American government. The young couple moved to Utah together where they had their first child. They named her America. 2 years later, Israel was born and Heidi just kept having kids. The thing is, Heidi didn't want to go to a hospital. Her and Jeff didn't believe in medicine. So all of her kids were born at home. They had no birth certificate, no social security number, no immunization, and they never attended school. Jeff worked as a repairman and Heidi babysat for extra cash, but it wasn't long until the neighbors realized that they were very strange. And also took note of the fact that they had 2 toddlers, but they were rarely outside. So one of the neighbors actually called the authorities on them. This prompted the Keys to move. They were like, we need to get the hell out of here so we can raise these kids how we want.
Oh, and they weren't Mormon anymore. Now they were fundamentalist Christian.
They moved to Coville, Washington, where they bought 160 acres on top of Aladdin Mountain. They rented a 1-room cabin that had no heat, no plumbing, and no electricity. Their plan was basically to build their own cabin on the mountain and, in the meantime, have more kids. They lived there for 7 years, while Jeff hiked up and down the mountain, chopping down trees and building the cabin himself. His father also worked at Aladdin Appliance as a repairman, and as Israel got older, he helped his father out building the cabin. Years later, when Israel made headlines, a lot of people would come forward to give insights about him. One woman particularly came forward and said that when she was about 10 or 11 years old, her family met the Keys family through Israel's father, through his business as an appliance repairman. She said that she and the Keys family were homeschooled and would get together informally with other homeschooled families. As a child, she recalled that Keys was extremely funny. In addition to homeschool gatherings, the Keys and other neighboring families got together once a month for potluck dinners to discuss their faith, which was described as non-denominational Christian. They did not have a church, but held their potlucks at a building that was referred to as the meeting place that her stepfather, Kelly Harris, built. Israel really took care of his siblings. He learned to cook and sew and clean and braid his sister's hair and teach them all kinds of things. They all learned to read by reading the Bible, and their parents would make them memorize Bible verses. Key's children were really deprived a lot because of their parents' strange beliefs. They never went to a doctor or a dentist. They wore hand-me-down clothes that didn't always fit them. Israel's toes were actually deformed because his shoes were too small growing up. They ate from the land, so from a really young age, Israel learned how to plant food, hunt, skin an animal, butcher it, prepare the meat, all that. He got really good at it. He was also really obsessed with guns, and that may not sound too uncommon, but he was very, very interested in them. He learned everything he could about them by finding ways to sneak books and magazines about guns and ammunition. When Israel was approximately 11 or 12 years old, he brought home several guns, which he said he found in a barrel in a shed. The guns were in poor condition, and Israel cleaned them up and took them to a gun dealer for an opinion of their worth. Israel eventually sold the guns to an unknown person, and lucky for us, somebody provided a photo of the guns that Israel had found and sold. This is also the year that Ted Bundy was executed. I bring this up because Israel would become a fan. Eventually, when he's arrested, investigators find movies and books about Bundy. Israel said that he was like his idol or whatever. So eventually the cabin's finished, and by now Israel is 12 years old. And his family starts attending this weird church down the road called the Ark. The Ark is a militia-based, white supremacist, anti-Semitic church. The very church that none other than the Kehoe family attended. Israel became friends with two of the Kehoe's sons, Chevy and Shane. Now, Chevy would go on to murder an entire family and dump their bodies in a swamp, and then the year after that, Chevy and Shane would get in a big shootout with the cops in Ohio, which was like all over the news, and then they would go on the run and eventually be arrested. Chevy would receive 3 consecutive life sentences for the murder of the Mueller family, and Shane would receive 24 years for the shootout with the cops. And then his brother implicated him in the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. But I'm gonna back this up because it's 1990 right now. Christian identity theology is the belief that white people are the original biblical Israelites. They promote incredibly racist ideologies and predict an apocalyptic race war that would be engineered by the Jews. Okay. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, the church taught that white people are the superior race and that the Bible is their story. Hardline identity followers believe that Jews are biblically satanic. Now, the pastor of the Ark, Dan Henry, says that he doesn't actually recall the Keyes family attending the church, but I think that they just didn't attend it regularly enough. They still did though, so. Both families also attended another Christian identity church, the Christian Israel Covenant Church, headed by Henry's neighbor and former acolyte, the late Ray Barker. Barker later facilitated Chevy Kehoe's 1997 surrender to law enforcement officials in Washington. The Keyes and the Kehoe family shared a lot in common besides attending a Christian identity church. They lived close to each other in Stevens County and also homeschooled their children. So here's a map of Aladdin Mountain and the proximity from the Keyes to the Kehoes to the Ark. So they all meet, and Israel learns that the Kehoes are really into guns. Israel's been obsessed with guns since he was like 6 years old, and now he actually has access to them on a large scale. Access to shoot them, access to learn how to take them apart and put them together. Israel had already been breaking into houses in Coville, which was the town at the base of the mountain that they lived on. Sometimes he would steal guns, he would steal all kinds of things and try and sell them. Sometimes he'd keep them. Like, he was a strange kid. He was also building bombs.
I used to carry a pistol all the time from the time I was about 14. And, I mean, by the time I was 14, I was basically the same size I am now. I didn't really look 14, and so I could get away with houses I broke into. I could get away with selling them, you know, without anybody knowing about it, without my parents knowing about it. And so I had a lot of guns, and I would always carry a gun. And
Izzy had been breaking into houses, and sometimes his sister Charity would go along with him. They would shoot BB guns at the houses, sometimes the windows of the houses, and if nobody came out, then they would break into the house. Sometimes they would just move the furniture around and then leave and hide so that when the owners of the house came back, they could watch them freak out. They also liked to set fires for fun and scare animals. Eventually, Israel stopped doing stuff like that with his sister because Charity would talk about the things that they did, and, you know, he wasn't really into that. He kind of liked to keep things to himself. I think probably also because things were escalating in his mind, and he knew that it wasn't a good idea to talk about this kind of stuff. His behavior was progressing like a textbook psychopath. He was learning to stalk prey and catch scented animals. He was learning how to camouflage himself. Sometimes he would sit up in trees and just watch people for hours. When he was 14, he was out in the woods with a friend of his, and for fun, he shot either a cat or a dog, but he shot an animal in the woods, and it really upset the friend that he was with, and Israel just couldn't understand why his friend was so upset. So Israel stopped hanging out with him.
There was one kid that I grew up with, and we used to break in houses together, and mostly like kid stuff. And but then there was a time when I think I shot something. I think it was a dog or a cat or something, and that was too much for him. He couldn't handle it. And so after that, I wouldn't do anything illegal, I guess you could say, with him.
Not long after that, Israel killed another cat in a more brutal way.
When I was 14, there were some friends staying with us, and there was a cat of ours that was always getting into the trash, and it was my sister's cat. And I told her at the time, I was like, if that cat gets into the trash again, I'm going to kill it. And there was this kid and some of his, I think maybe one of my sisters and one of his sisters, we all went up into the woods, and I had the cat with me. And took a piece of parachute cord and tied it to this tree. And the parachute cord was about 10 feet long, and I had a .22 revolver with me. And I shot it in the stomach, and it ran around and around the tree, and then like crashed into the tree, and then started vomiting. And as soon as that, like, for me, I didn't really react. I mean, I actually kind of laughed a little, I think, because of the way it was running around the tree. But then I looked over at everybody else, and the kid who was about my age was with me. He was throwing up. Like, he was like really, I don't know, traumatized, I guess you would say. He told his dad about it, and then of course his dad talked to my parents about it, and that was pretty much the last time anybody went in the woods with me. I learned my lesson.
Then Israel was like,
well, I guess I can't hang out with that guy anymore.
so he's really losing friends. Like, can't hang out with my sister, can't hang out with these other two guys. He started realizing that he wasn't normal. He wasn't like other people.
But I've known since I was 14 that there were things that I thought were normal and that were okay that nobody else seems to think are normal and okay. So that's when I just started being a loner, I guess. I got in trouble a few times around that age. People found out about some of the stuff I did, like my parents and parents of other kids who would hang out with me. They would find out about some of the stuff I did, and that's when I just started doing stuff by myself pretty much exclusively.
In 1994, when Israel was 16, he built himself his own cabin. This was the same year that his older sister America got married to a guy named Stephen Todd Wolfe. And that's where this picture was taken. At the time that this picture was taken, only 8 of the 10 Keyes children had been born. America there with her wedding veil, standing next to Stephen. There's Israel standing right behind Heidi, his mom. Jeff's there, kneeling down. Then there's Charity, Sunshine, Autumn Rose, Isaac, Elijah, and Hosanna. The following year, Ezra would be born, and then soon after that, Jubilee. First time Ezra was arrested, he was 16 years old. He had gone down the mountain into town and decided that he wanted to steal something. He got caught shoplifting. He was given community service, and that was pretty much it. He really managed to stay off the grid. So at this point, Israel is a bit of a problem child. Heidi and Jeff are really just losing interest in the Ark and white supremacy. Around 1995 or 1996, Israel's parents decided that they wanted to move again. They've decided that they want to be Amish now. They sold their house and temporarily moved to the meeting place. This is a picture outside what is believed to be the meeting place. It's labeled Passover Feast 1996 May. Another note about this picture is that the car you're looking at is Israel's car. This is where the story takes a sharp, sinister turn. Israel is 17 years old now. A 12-year-old girl named Julie Harris goes missing. March 3rd, 1996. 12-year-old Caucasian female, 5'1", about 115 pounds, bluish hazel eyes, and sandy blonde hair. Julie was known as a funny kid and a bit of a prankster. She was a double amputee and had prosthetic feet and braces so she could walk, and got really into the Special Olympics and actually won a gold medal in downhill skiing, which she was very proud of. On the morning she disappeared, nothing seemed abnormal. Julie got up, she was getting ready to go to church. She had on a black and pink striped sweater, and she never made it to church. The Stevens County Sheriff's Office had nothing on this, and Sherry, Julie's mother, was freaking out. She said they weren't doing enough, and she started putting up flyers everywhere that said, "Please help," in all caps, and had a picture of Julie with Julie's stats. But there were no leads until sometime in April, a few weeks after Julie's disappearance, when her prosthetics and her purse were found in the Colville River, or near the Colville River, where it flows into Lake Roosevelt at Kettle Falls. And that's when this case went from a kidnapping to a possible homicide. About 6 months went by, and Sherry basically had a breakdown. It was daytime out, and she was out at a park, and she fell to her knees. She was just crying and screaming, and she was in such distress that she had to be hospitalized. The winter of 1996, the Keyes family moved to Oregon, but Israel stayed behind in Colville to start working. He was now 18, and he had a girlfriend, and he wanted to stay with her. His parents didn't like that he had a girlfriend because they're very, very religious. Remember Kelly Harris, the guy who built the meeting place? Well, he hired Israel, and Israel did some construction work in Colville for him for about 6 months. Meanwhile, in Oregon, Jeff and Heidi and their whole family were living in a warehouse. They stayed with and worked for an unnamed family at their co-op health food warehouse called Azure Standing in the town of Dufur. This family was known for their philanthropy, and they helped provide for the Keyes, who were quite poor. Then Saturday, April 26th, 1997, skeletal remains were found in a wooded area about 6 miles outside of Colville to the southwest. Some children were playing in the area and came across these unburied skeletal remains. A friend of Sherry's is actually the one who broke the news to her, and Sherry goes to the police department, and she said, "I went to the police station and they said,
Yeah, what do you know?
how livid would you be?" Saturday, May 10th, at the Kettle Falls Assembly of God Church, a memorial service was held for Julie. Years later, Sherry said that she remembered Israel at a house that Julie used to go to, and I'm wondering if this is the meeting house. Sherry said she had a really icky feeling about him. Someone came forward and said that they remembered seeing Julie walking down Main Street with a very tall, thin man in a trench coat. Israel was very tall. He was a little over 6 feet by the time he was 16. Memories that she thought were irrelevant started to become vital. Sherry said that she remembers seeing Israel in the neighborhood. Also, Julie's best friend came forward and said that she saw Julie and Israel talking at the pool, the local swimming pool, and that she believes that Julie actually gave him her phone number and home address. Israel never confessed to the murder of Julie, but moving from killing animals to children and then to adult humans is kind of a natural progression for serial killers. It's almost like stepping stones. It's fairly common, and I would not be surprised if Israel was responsible for this. The thing is, though, June 27th, 1997, another 12-year-old girl goes missing. Shortly after Julie's memorial service, Marlene K. Emerson and Cassie Emerson. Cassie was born the 2nd of November 1984 in Portland, Multnomah County, Oregon. 5 feet 3 inches tall, weighs about 93 pounds. She has blonde shoulder-length hair and blue eyes. Marlene, her mother, was born the 26th of February 1968, also in Portland. Marlene was 29 and Cassie, as I said, was 12. Marlene and Cassie lived together at the Panorama Mobile Home Park about half a dozen miles outside of Colville. The trailer was destroyed by arson, with Marlene's charred body found inside, and Cassie was gone. Sheriff's deputies believe that Marlene was killed and that the fire was set intentionally to cover this up. The FBI thinks that Cassie at some point was taken across state lines. Cassie's decomposed body was found a month later near an old lodging road about 3 miles from the trailer. Sheriff's deputy did say that he does not believe the Emerson's case to be connected to Julie's case. He said, "We've got our suspicions." That's a great quote. But similar to the case with Julie, there are other people who the finger has been pointed at, but no one has been charged. Now, Israel never confessed to killing Cassie or Marlene, but he did tell investigators that the first thing he ever burned down was a trailer. And he did say that in his late teens, he had decided that he could rape or kill somebody and get away with it. After Israel completed the work on what I believe was a 6-part duplex with Kelly Harris, he had saved up money and decided to move to Oregon. Jeff was very ill. He had thyroid disease and was struggling a lot, and the Keys family was heavily depending on Israel. They really relied on him to support their family. And when he got there, I guess his parents had moved out of the health food co-op. They were living in tents. Now that Israel was with his family again, they forbade him from writing his girlfriend in Colville. Apparently they got really protective and obsessive of their children because they didn't want their older kids to stay behind in Colville. So America's gone. Now Israel's the eldest. Jeff is really sick and Israel's really doing most of the work and providing for the family. I can see how they would start really clinging to him. It was almost like building their own cult. Their children were like a workforce for them, basically. Heidi actually referred to them as assets. Anyways, they were all living in tents, just utter poverty. Basically, Heidi and Jeff bought a small house in need of repair on a piece of property. The house sat on a hill overlooking a valley. The family purchased the property as an investment, and their plan was to renovate and sell the property in the fall of 1997 and move to New York. The family built a fence around the property and lived in tents while renovations took place. Keys moved to Oregon to be with his family in the spring of 1997, and he and a friend performed the house renovations. During 1997, the Keys family, including Israel, frequently went to the Deschutes River to swim. They found a secluded area along the riverbank where they most often congregated. From their vantage point, however, they could see the area where rafters and tubers often went into the water, and during the summer months, many rafters and tubers floated by the area where the Keys family swam. There were also many fishermen along the river. and it's at this time when Israel claims to have raped his first victim, despite later saying that she wasn't the first person that he had sexually assaulted. Anyways, there's this river in Central Oregon called the Deschutes River, and inner tubing is very popular there. So Israel thought, oh, I'll just hide on the beach and watch people float by. So it gets towards the end of the day and the sun is coming down, and there's this group of teenagers that floats by. And Israel realizes that at the very end of their group is a girl, and she's kind of, you know, hanging back from everybody else. So he decides to wade into the water and grab her. He said she was like 14 to 18 with sandy blonde hair, and he drags her up to a remote campground bathroom. It's a handicap accessible bathroom, so it has bars on the wall. So he has the lid of the latrine down and he lays her over it. He ties a rope around her neck, which he then secures to one of the bars on the wall. He ties both of her arms outward so that she's completely immobilized, and then he rapes her. He later tells investigators that he originally planned to strangle her to death and then dump her in the waste pit below because he didn't think that she would be found for a while. You know, the smell. Apparently, though, she was talking a lot and it threw him off. In his own words, "I was too timid, I wasn't violent enough. I made up my mind I was never going to let that happen again."
I don't know. I just, I didn't, the main thing is I just lost my nerve right at the end because I mean, that never stopped me after that, you know, people would always talk to me.
So he actually let this girl go. He thinks maybe her name started with an L, like Leah or Lena, but regardless, he says that he regrets not killing her. At this point, the Keyes family has lived in the awful tents for about a year, and they are ready to move again. This time, they buy a little farmhouse on 10 acres of land in New York, just on the border of Canada. Jeff, his father, actually ended up signing the deed of the farmhouse over to Israel for $1. And I'm not actually sure why he did this, but Israel ended up burying 9,000 black Talon pistol rounds throughout the property. It's illegal ammo, so I guess that makes sense. Israel was a really smart guy, and at this point in his life, he's like, I gotta get out of here. So he decides to start taking some courses so that he can get his GED, and then he wants to join the army. While he's taking his courses, another girl goes missing. March 2nd, 1998, State University of New York at Albany. Suzanne Gloria Lyall. Suzanne is a 19-year-old college student, Caucasian, long hair with bangs. She worked part-time at Babbage's Software at the Crossgate Mall in Guilderland, New York. She left work at about 9:20 p.m. and walked to a bus stop close to the mall. She was headed back to her campus dorm room. Susie was last seen getting off the bus around 9:45 p.m., so she was likely abducted sometime between then and walking to her dorm. Israel never confessed to killing Suzanne, but the time and place line up just right. So it's not long before Israel gets his GED and tells his whole family that he's joining the military. His dad is pissed. He does not support the military. He is not happy about this decision. Then Israel also tells him that he hasn't believed in God for a really long time. They have a huge falling out. Essentially, Jeff disowns his son. But Izzy is pretty much over it at this point. So Israel enlists in the army in Albany, New York, and goes on to basic training. I'm not sure what he listed as his desired MOS or military occupational specialty, but he started out as MOS code 11C or 11 Charlie, which is indirect fire infantryman. In other words, Israel was part of a mortar platoon. On July 9th, 1988, he joins the US Army. Israel is based in Fort Lewis in Washington, but over his career he would also serve in Fort Hood in Texas and in Egypt. His military buddies had some shit to say about him, some good, some weird. Keys was described as a good soldier, someone who was squared away. Keys was a large individual who had broad shoulders and a big nose. He was someone who was very quiet when he first checked into the platoon. Keys kept to himself a lot of the time and did not really begin to drink until he was assigned a roommate. He and his roommate wouldn't really go off base to drink, but instead they stayed around and would go over to the non-commissioned officers club on the base and would just get a lot of beer and drink at the barracks. In the spring of 1999, he trained at JOTC at Fort Sherman in Panama, which was the Army's training center for light infantry and special operation units like the one Israel was in. This footage is from the 25th Infantry Division during training in 1969. It's public domain, which is why I'm using it, but it's really cool, and it really wasn't quite so different 30 years later. Soldiers undergo intensive tropical jungle warfare training nicknamed Green Hell. To summarize, everyone gets a machete. Israel already had by choice spent hours up in the trees of Aladdin Mountain watching people, like a fucking creep. So instead of the forest, now he's in a tropical jungle learning new survival skills best suited for combat. The Jungle Warfare Course, JWC, is a 3-week training event. As infantry, Israel would have trained in tasks necessary to perform in a jungle environment. These tasks include jungle living, jungle antennas, land navigation, mines and booby traps, jungle combat techniques, waterborne training, squad react to contact, contact meaning live fire, and squad area reconnaissance. In addition, specialized training for Israel's mortar platoon would be included. So mortar jungle combat techniques, mines and booby traps, and a live fire mortar maneuver course. Training involves navigating areas with little to no roads, dense vegetation, and low visibility for line of sight. Techniques for how to utilize materials for camouflage and shelter are taught. Stealth traveling through thick plant life is sharpened. Tropical jungles are a source of disease and dangerous animals, especially the bushmaster snake. Like, holy shit. I thought the video of training and identifying and handling the wildlife was interesting, especially considering Israel's history with animals. There is no doubt that Israel utilized these skills to carry out his murders. He trained as a mortarman, but one guy in his platoon would later tell the FBI that Israel spent a lot of time building a ghillie suit, which is really something snipers use. Customized tactical camouflage on a serial killer does not a happy outcome make. Seriously though, the last thing Israel needed was a machete. So he completes his training in jungle warfare, and in 2000, Israel was deployed to Egypt as part of multinational force and observers, which is a peacekeeping force set up in the 80s between America, Egypt, and Israel. From my understanding, Israel's unit was just making sure that no one crossed the border from Saudi and that Egyptian and Israeli forces weren't crossing into the Sinai either. His platoon sergeant said, Keys was an excellent soldier, and of approximately 30 underlings, Keys was the only soldier who could be counted on to do his job. This would have been a pretty uneventful 6 months in regards to combat, but in regards to taking a trip to Tel Aviv for the weekend, pretty uneventful is not how I would describe it. He and his buddies had gone to Tel Aviv for a few days, and he had 2 strange experiences with women, one with a Norwegian exchange student and one with a prostitute. In both of these experiences, he described himself as losing control and scaring both of the women. These 2 experiences made him realize that he needed to wait to do this kind of stuff until he got out of the military. He actually said, "I can't wait to get out of the military so I can start killing." One guy in his squad said that he remembered Keys being a heavy drinker and suspects that he also used marijuana, although he could not recall any specific incidences. He described Keys as a happy drunk, but also recalled Keys having a few violent outbursts. He clarified that this was not necessarily unusual behavior with the guys who drank heavily. In addition to drinking heavily and smoking weed, Israel also tried LSD twice and used cocaine pretty often, though he did eventually stop. He also branded himself multiple times. While Israel was in the Middle East, he got branded at his own request. Despite thinking it was a stupid idea, one of the other soldiers heated up a clothes hanger and made a single brand on the left arm of Keys above the elbow. At this point, Keyes decided that he would not go through with the rest of the pentagram due to the pain of the single line branded into him by this other person, who was actually the person that suggested that Keyes get a pentagram branded onto his arm. Many other members of the platoon were present while this was happening, and while they thought it was a dumb idea, they all cheered it on anyway. When asked about Keyes' brands, one of the guys in his unit said that he remembered during a barbecue that there was banter between Keyes and another guy about Keyes' brands, and that Keyes kept teasing this guy about, like, hey, I'm gonna get drunk and I'm gonna brand you. But in the end, Keyes got drunk and branded himself. It's believed that this incident is when Keyes got the smiley face brand that is on his arm. Keyes used a coat hanger to make the branding iron. It's understood that some of his other brands were obtained while he was in the army. So Israel has a total of 3 brands. He has the smiley face one on his arm, he has an upside down cross on his chest, and then on his shoulder he has a brand that says IZ for Izzy. Israel's closest friend in the military was without a doubt his roommate, and they did just about everything together, but most of all they lifted weights together. They also drank together, took acid together, and scheduled a trip to Idaho for a weekend to attend a white supremacist meeting. It's unclear if Israel and his roommate actually went to the meeting, but they definitely expressed desire to go. In addition, Israel's roommate was artistic, and when Israel told him a story about how he liked to chase squirrels and try and kill them with a chainsaw, his roommate said that he would be interested in making a cartoon drawing of the event. Israel didn't have a vehicle and never spent any of his money on anything besides military gear, specifically at the tactical tailor near the base to improve his vest. He also made gear of his own, possibly a skill he learned while growing up. The most elaborate thing that he made for himself was his own ghillie suit. Israel was described as typically even-keeled, often speaking in a monotone voice, but on 2 separate occasions he got very angry. One time was after a 15-mile ruck march led by the company executive officer, the second in command of the company. Keyes, being one of the largest soldiers in the company, was one of the men who were assigned to carry the mortar tube and plate. The mortar tube and plate probably weighed approximately 60 pounds or more, including the rest of his equipment. His total weight load was probably 110 pounds for an entire 15-mile march. Upon returning to the barracks, Keyes threw the mortar tube and plate across his barracks room at the television, breaking it. The other time Keyes lost his temper was during a payback operation. This is when a soldier has the opportunity to address any problem that he or she might have with another soldier. Both soldiers would be in the middle of a circle made up of other soldiers with boxing gloves. The soldiers in the middle would box, and the problem that did exist was then resolved, and a paper trail was never started. Some soldiers had a problem with Keyes, so they entered the circle. This one soldier punched Keyes in the nose pretty hard while they were boxing, and this is what angered Keyes. He lost his temper at that point and beat the soldier to the point where some other soldiers had to intervene to pull Keyes off of the soldier being beaten up. Another guy in his unit remembers Keyes talking about going hunting. Keyes had a few hunting magazines that he subscribed to, and that Keyes was very familiar with animals, but that he severely disliked all animals. While most people who do not like animals will try to avoid them, Keyes would approach animals for the purpose of hurting them. Keyes told a story of the best way to kill a goat, that is to hit it on the head with a baseball bat. The events that would happen after someone brained the goat was that the brains would come out of the goat's nose. The goat would be dead and still standing up. There was a time when Keyes tied a cat to a tree and then shot the cat in the stomach with a .22 caliber bullet. The cat would try to run away, but it would only go in circles around the tree it was tied to. While in the Middle East, Keyes would put 2 scorpions in an ammo can so that one would kill the other. This would happen from time to time with a large group of people around, but Keyes did this on occasion by himself. Most of the time when Keyes would tell stories about doing these things to animals, Keyes would tell the stories in a proud and humorous way. In regards to Israel's hobbies, it's said that he liked to play online video games. He was also a good baker and would bake pies and fudge, and noted that he could bake better than most moms could, which he attributes to growing up with all women. Israel really liked science fiction movies and enjoyed the Resident Evil series with Mila Jovovich. Israel was a big NFL Vikings football fan, and once during a Vikings-Eagle game, there was a bet that was made and Israel lost. As a result, he had to wear a cow costume for Halloween. It's noted that Israel was a good sport about it and did it. During the following Super Bowl game, he lost a bet again and had to wear Eagles clothing to work. Apparently he was teased quite a bit about it by his coworkers. Israel really loved coffee and he used to smoke cigarettes, and it was noted that his smoking was a point of tension at times, and Keyes used to walk around with toothpicks in his mouth because of his former habit. Israel loved boating and camping and even went ziplining in Belize one time. He also loved Wild Turkey Bourbon and Insane Clown Posse.
If I was a serial killer, they would find all my victims' heads in funky-ass gas station toilets. And if I was a serial killer, I would be strange and deranged. And I would never change. If I was a serial killer, I would sleep on broken glass and thumbtacks, and I would smoke med crack. If I was a serial killer, first thing I would do would be to kill a couple hotties. Decapitated bodies. Dumped on state police lawn just before dawn.
And then he turns out to actually be a serial killer.
Israel Keyes is wanted by the FBI.
Anyways, so in late 2000, Israel meets a woman online named Tammie. And now Israel's back in the US, he's back in Washington, and Tammie lives really close by to Fort Lewis. She lives on a designated reservation of the Maka tribe called Neah Bay. Tammie was a pretty half Native American, half black woman who had an 8-year-old son from a previous relationship. I think she was about 10 years older than Israel was, and they decided to have their first date in late December. It started off as a lunch date and then ended up turning into a movie and dinner. So they really hit it off right away. They were both big drinkers. Actually, Israel wound up getting a DUI on the army base, and they both had similar childhoods that they were able to bond over. They were really inseparable, and it only took about a few months before Tammie told Israel that she was pregnant. July 8th of 2001, Israel was honorably discharged from the army. Israel got out of the military. He was an E4, or a corporal, which is the highest rank for a junior enlisted recruit. He also got out literally a couple months before September 11th. While in the military, Israel received the Army Achievement Medal, the Army Service Ribbon, the Marksman Badge with Rifle Bar, Expert Infantry Badge, and Air Assault Badge.
He said that it was in his kind of early 20s, mid-20s that he really came to terms with who he was, recognizing that he was different from other people and that he had these urges, and that there wasn't, he tried to initially blame it on, Satan and religious things and why he was like this and a number of different things. And then he ultimately realized that that's just who he was, and he accepted that. And I think that as he began to do that, it became easier for him to do. He talked about enjoying the fact that he was two different people and really being able to play that off with people, and that people had absolutely no idea what he was doing. He even referenced times where he would be at his job when he was living in Washington, and people would talk about criminals and how stupid they were and how they did this to get caught or that to get caught, and how he enjoyed those kind of conversations because people had no clue what he was doing.
So now that Israel was out of the military, he decided to move to Neah Bay. So he moved onto the reservation. Initially, he was receiving unemployment, and around the reservation, he was doing odd jobs. He was really good at fixing things, really good carpenter, and really good with construction and woodwork. After a little while, he started working for the Parks and Recreation Commission. Him and Tammie really seemed like a good couple initially. They had a cat named Puff. They were living together, and in October 2001, they welcomed home their daughter. After his daughter was born, Tammie said that she could see a change in Israel. He just loved being a father so much. He would go to work bragging about his daughter. He actually ended up doing a lot of the parenting, because after their daughter was born, Tammie was complaining of abdominal pain, and she went to the doctor and found out that she had uterine cancer. So she had an emergency hysterectomy, and that messed with her hormones a lot, and I think she was depressed. She was on pain medication as well, so she was just kind of out of it. This actually worked in Israel's favor. because yes, he's a very committed father, he loves his daughter very much and he's taking care of her, but he's also a psychopath. So the fact that Tammie is out of it gave him a little more wiggle room to get away with things. It was at this time that, in addition to his brands, he got a tattoo of the sigil of Baphomet on the back of his neck. Actually, it might have just been a pentagram. Israel was just really into Satan. Tammie said that she didn't really think much of it because she assumed it was just him kind of rebelling against his upbringing. In 2012, Israel's father, John Jeffrey Keyes, died. He was 50 years old. His funeral service was November 25th, 2002 at the Smyrna Amish Meeting House in Maine, and Israel did attend. He was a casket bearer along with a few of his brothers and America's husband, Stephen. John Jeffrey Keyes was buried at the Keyes family cemetery. Israel's behavior is odd. He's definitely looking for victims. He's stalking people. One woman from Santa Barbara came forward with a story about Israel from 2004. She was on a road trip in the Chesapeake Bay region and pulled over to stop for the night. She was napping in her car with a blanket pulled close to her head when she heard someone trying to jimmy the lock on the door. She heard a scratching noise and saw Keyes standing there. She saw him smiling at her with his bare teeth as he was pounding on the window with both hands. She just thought it was someone strung out on drugs, and she didn't give it much thought, but she did remember that Keyes reminded her of the guitarist from the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Yeah, I can see that. In 2005, Israel met another woman online named Kimberly Anderson. He and Tammie were having issues. She basically was still struggling with maintaining her sobriety, and they just weren't really getting along anymore. And Kimberly was a traveling nurse, and you know, for someone who travels a lot, that seemed like a good fit, especially if you're trying to hide the reasons for your travel. But then, June 24th, 2006, Gilbert Mark Gilman goes missing in Thurston County, Washington. 47-year-old Caucasian male, born November 26, 1958, is 5'7", about 155 to 165 pounds. Gilbert decided to go hiking with just his camera at the Olympic National Park. He was supposed to meet a colleague later that day, but never showed up. His colleague filed a missing persons report the very next day. A few days later, Gilbert's car was found in the Olympic National Park at the Staircase Ranger Station off State Route 101. Now, his mother believes that Gil decided to become a spy because of his background with the government. Gil used to work as a military interrogator, and in addition to English, he speaks Russian, Chinese, and Arabic fluently. So many people believe that Israel Keyes was lurking up in the trees watching people go by as he does, just waiting for someone to cross his path. Israel never confessed to the murder of Gilbert Gilman, but investigators believe that he might have used his boat to dispose of the body. Oh yeah, he bought a boat in 2005. And he may have used this boat not only to dispose of Gilbert's body, but others too. So back to the issues he and Tammie are having. Long story short, he decides to move up with Kimberly to Anchorage, Alaska in 2007 and start his own business called Keyes Construction. Alaska is like the Wild West. A lot of people say that. It's kind of a great place for him to move to. People kind of mind their own business. Everyone's got guns. So in Anchorage, his business starts to do pretty well. People start to recognize him as being a good fixer-upper. Locals actually trust him with the keys to their houses. Locals said that they never got a bad feeling about him and that he was a really hard worker. One local joked that the only thing that was weird about him was how hard of a worker he was. Like, he's good, he never steals anything, he does good work. Cool. I'm out of coffee.
Throughout his time in Alaska, Israel was still traveling all over the place.
April 9th, 2009, Debra Feldman disappears in Hackensack, New Jersey. She's a 49-year-old Caucasian female. Unfortunately, Debra was kind of a perfect victim. She was a drifter. She was battling a terrible drug addiction, which she funded by selling her body for cash. Authorities believe that she was buried somewhere upstate. Israel admitted to taking someone during that trip, but then denied knowing Debra at all. But then he showed a picture of her, and he stops and looks at it and says, "I don't want to talk about her yet."
Yeah, I just don't want to talk about her.
Debra had a 24-year-old son named Matthew when she died. The very next day, April 10th, 2009, Israel robs a bank in Tupper Lake, New York, and admits to it. Israel is escalating now. So Israel flies from Anchorage to Chicago on June 2nd, and then he drives to Indiana. June 3rd, 2011, Lauren Spierer disappears after a night at Kilroy Sports Bar in Bloomington, Indiana. 21-year-old Caucasian female, blonde hair, born January 17th, 1991. She was a pretty Indiana University sophomore, just going out for a few drinks. So Lauren is very intoxicated and unfortunately ends up walking home alone.
Spierer, a college student, was last seen on street cameras at 11th Street and College Avenue in Bloomington, Indiana. After leaving a local bar on June 3rd, 2011, she'd been drinking and left her cell phone and purse in the bar.
Like most of Israel's suspected victims, he did not confess to this one. More coffee. So Israel then makes the 14-hour drive from Indiana to Vermont. June 8th, 2011, Essex, Vermont. Bill and Lorraine Currier disappear. Bill was 50 years old and his wife Lorraine was 55 years old. Bill worked at the University of Vermont as a lab assistant and Lorraine worked at a local hospital. They had just celebrated their 25th anniversary. So Israel had what he called a kill cache or a kill kit stashed near the Winooski River. These kill kits contained all kinds of materials that he might need to kill somebody. So he goes and picks this one up and he's thinking, tonight I'm kind of in the mood for raping and murdering a male. So he starts stalking the area and he sees a young man in, I believe, a Volkswagen, Ted Bundy style, and he's driving up to an apartment complex and Keyes is trailing along the parking lot area. He's getting ready for this guy to park. He's getting ready to pounce on him right as he gets out of his car. But it started to rain, and this guy gets out of his car really, really fast. He's holding a newspaper over his head as a makeshift umbrella, and he starts running into the apartment complex. And Keyes goes to grab him and misses. Later, he'll tell investigators that if that guy was a few seconds slower getting out of his car, that he would have been the one that night.
I had that parking lot staked out, waiting for somebody after, like fairly late. I was gonna take them and use the cutoff tool to lock the gate and then do my thing there in the parking lot, and then I had the drain on the shovel stocked up there as a way to get rid of the body if I needed it. So, but that never happened. No.
It's only around 8 or 9 p.m. and Israel is undeterred. He goes back to the Handy Suites where he's staying and he chills there for a few hours and doesn't go back out until just after midnight. So Israel leaves the Handy Suites shortly after midnight. He's on foot and he just starts walking. And he hits this neighborhood area on Colbert Street, or Colbert Street. He stops in front of house 8, and because of all of his construction experience, he's kind of looking at the house and he can basically guess the layout, where the master bedroom is. So he starts to stake out the house. Now, Israel has a couple rules: no kids and no dogs. His no kids rule came about after he had his daughter. He doesn't mess with kids. At least that's what he says. And his no dogs rule isn't because he doesn't like dogs per se. I mean, he and Kimberly have 2. It's because dogs are a hassle. They're just another obstacle. So he goes and checks the backyard. Bill and Lorraine have a pool, and there aren't any floaties, there aren't any toys, there aren't any slobbery tennis balls. So he's like, okay, cool, no kids, no dogs, check, check. The first thing that Keyes did when he got to their house was cut the power line and cut the phone line. That essentially, no matter what happened, left Bill and Lorraine helpless. So he walks back around front and he gets into the house by removing the ventilation fan from the garage window. He jumps through it. Now he's in the garage, he grabs a crowbar from the wall, he's moving quick, he goes up to the door, breaks the glass, and now he's inside. He's wearing a headlamp at this point and turns the light on. So he goes down the hallway, finds the master bedroom, and it takes him about 6 seconds from breaking in the master bedroom to getting Bill and Lorraine awake and zip-tied. He calls this a blitz attack. 6 seconds is pretty fast, and it's disorienting for the people that it's happening to. It takes them a minute to figure out what's going on. The Golden State Killer did something similar. He would wake people up with a flashlight in their face, so it would blind them. He'd have a gun on them. Very, very confusing. It's effective. Now, Izzy is holding a gun on Bill and Lorraine. He demands that they give him any guns that they have. Lorraine's like, I got a .38 Smith & Wesson in my nightstand. Just take it. Take whatever you want. So he takes that. He also takes their ATM cards, gets their PIN number. He grabs their suitcases and just starts packing it with stuff. Jewelry, clothing, whatever. He also took some bottles of Vicodin and Percocet. Lorraine tried to fight him while he was doing this, and good for her. But it really pissed him off, and he grabs her by the neck, throws her down on the bed, and shoves her face into a pillow and says, if you do that again, I'm not going to be happy. So he keeps rummaging through all of their stuff and comes across an electric strawberry. It's not a sex toy, I know it sounds like one. It's an army insignia for the 25th Infantry Division. So he realizes that he and Bill served in the same unit, and he tells Bill this to kind of use it as a manipulation tool, maybe give him a little bit of hope. It's pretty twisted. All in all, this took about 15 minutes before Israel had Bill and Lorraine put their slippers on and walk into the garage, get in their green Saturn sedan, belted them both in. He puts the crowbar back, he puts the fan back, and then he gets in the car and drives away with their suitcases in the car, with them in the car, driving their own car.
And at that point, he was still like trying to talk me out of it. He's like, just let us go. I know you're in too deep, but we haven't really seen you. You can still walk away. And I just kind of laughed at him. I was like, I don't know if I actually said anything, but in my head, I was like, you don't even know how much planning I put into this, and just walk away.
Israel takes them to a location that he had scoped out earlier in the day, an abandoned farmhouse. Like, how horror movie can you get? When they first get there, Israel takes Bill out of the car and takes him to the basement entrance, down into the basement, and ties him to a stool. Then he goes back out for Lorraine, who's standing outside of the car. When she sees him, she starts to run, and he has to chase her down and tackle her, and he's even more pissed. He's like, you already tried this shit once, and now you're running away from me? He drags Lorraine into the farmhouse. At this point, Bill's yelling, where's Lorraine? Where's my wife? Israel forces Lorraine up the stairs and duct tapes her wrists and ankles to the bed, puts a rope around her neck, and then wraps it around the mattress with a compound knot, so Lorraine's not going anywhere. During the sexual assault of Lorraine, Keyes said that he heard Bill Currier attempting to break out of his restraints.
Keyes went down to the basement where he saw the stool to which Bill Currier was restrained had broken and the bindings were loose. Israel is not happy about this because things are not going the way that he wants them to go. Bill starts talking to Israel and asking him a lot of questions. Israel is not about that. He doesn't want his victims to talk. He wants them to be scared. Israel's plan was to rape both Bill and Lorraine. So he goes over to Bill to grab him, and Bill starts moving around so much that he almost knocks Israel over. He's not happy about that. He's not in control. When people don't act the way that he wants them to fulfill this fantasy he's envisioned, it makes him mad, and that's his malignant narcissism talking. So to solve this problem, Israel grabs a shovel and he hits Bill with it. Keyes and Bill Currier fought, during which Keyes struck him with a shovel Keyes found in the basement. It takes more than once because this ex-army guy ain't going down that easy. So he hits him again. Bill finally falls to the ground. Israel then quickly runs upstairs to get the .22 caliber with a silencer on it because the gun that he brought down to the basement, the .40 caliber, is too loud. He doesn't want Lorraine to hear. He gets the gun, he runs back downstairs, and when he gets to the basement, he sees that Bill is standing up again. He's back on his feet, and he's yelling at Israel. Israel has had enough. Without hesitation, he shoots Bill Currier in the arms, the chest, the neck, and the head. Bill falls to the floor, dead, and Israel goes outside to have a cigar. When he goes back upstairs, he uses a knife to cut Lorraine's clothes off. Then he stuffs her mouth with paper towels and he rapes her. Not just once, he rapes her twice. And the second time, he actually chokes her out. When she comes to, he cuts her restraints and walks her down to the basement so that she can see her dead husband in a pool of blood. He sits her down, probably on the same stool that Bill was tied to, and then he goes behind her and he strangles her to death. And just to be sure, he ties a zip tie around her neck and pulls it as tight as he can. He stated that he wore leather gloves during the murders. After murdering both Bill Currier and Lorraine Currier, Keyes moved the bodies to a corner of the basement and bagged them by placing 2 bags over each body. 1 bag over the head to mid-body, the second bag placed over the feet and up to mid-body. Keyes also poured a gallon of Drano on each of the bodies. Keyes then took old shelving and ducting he found in the basement and placed these items over the bagged bodies in an attempt to conceal them. His original plan was to burn the farmhouse down, but he's out of time. The sun's coming up. So he decides, if I just cover these bags and leave them here in the basement, this farmhouse is so dilapidated, it's pointless to restore. If anyone buys this property, they're gonna demolish the house. They're not even gonna go to the basement because the stench, it's going to reek. So Israel leaves the bodies there. He gets in Bill and Lorraine's car, their green Saturn sedan, and he drives to a nearby Rite Aid and parks as far away from the security cameras as possible and leaves the car there. In addition to taking his backpack with him when leaving the farmhouse, Keyes also took with him the following items. The items used during the sexual assault of Lorraine Currier, Lorraine's clothes, and Bill's sandals. Keyes said that he kept Bill and Lorraine Currier's cell phones and their debit card to which he received the PIN number from them, and their .38 revolver. Keyes claimed to have later disposed of the phones. Keyes also claimed to have disposed of most of the jewelry. Keyes said that he disposed of the items he used during the kidnapping, sexual assault, and murders, as well as Lorraine Currier's lingerie, clothing, and their suitcases. So that morning, Bill's sister, who works at the hospital with Lorraine, calls her brother to figure out where Lorraine is. But of course, she can't get a hold of Bill either. Now, this is incredibly abnormal for Bill and Lorraine. People who know them and people who work with them know that they're very reliable and they've both been at their jobs for nearly 20 years. So the fact that neither of them have showed up to work and no one can reach them is without a doubt alarming. So no one's answering the phone, no one showed up to work. Bill's sister decides to go to her brother's house, and when she realizes that their car is not there,
Their green Saturn sedan is gone. She decides to call the Essex PD. So around 10 a.m., police department gets a phone call about Bill and Lorraine as missing persons. So then Essex PD goes to the Currier house, house number 8 on Colbert Street, and nothing seems out of place, except for the fact that the car is gone. But besides that, the house, there's no clear signs of forced entry until someone is peeking in the garage and, the car is obviously gone, but they notice something else. They noticed that there's broken glass on the floor, and that's when they knew something was wrong. Interestingly enough, that broken glass would be the only physical evidence that Israel would ever leave behind at any of his crime scenes. He was very aware of that as it was happening, but the precaution that he took, if you recall, was to ensure that Bill and Lorraine put their slippers on so as not to cut their feet and track blood. And besides that, he knew that there would be no shred of evidence. Then the investigation moved further, and on top of the broken glass, the missing car, the police discovered that Bill's medication was at home. He has a problem wherein the vertebrae of his neck are fused together and he can't actually move his neck from side to side, and that medication is imperative, and his sister and everyone who knows him knows that he wouldn't leave it. Also, Lorraine wore glasses, and her glasses were there, but the gun was gone. Odd. In addition, they found wallets and a few other personal items that, particular to Bill and Lorraine, are things that they wouldn't travel without if they were going to travel. Israel later disposed of the gun that he stole from the Currier's home and the gun that he used to shoot Bill with in the Blake Falls Reservoir. Israel then left Vermont, drove back to Chicago, boarded a flight to San Francisco where he stayed a night, and was back in Anchorage by the 16th. So Israel is gone. Shortly after this, a witness came forward and said that they saw somebody driving the Currier's green Saturn sedan. Obviously, that would be Israel. So the witness was brought in to work with a forensic sketch artist, and the composite sketch, which, as you can see, doesn't closely resemble Keyes, but I feel like it's not bad for somebody who just saw a person drive by. Keyes saw that. He saw the composite sketch that came out and would later tell investigators that it didn't worry him because he didn't think it looked anything like him, and he was 3,000 miles away. Not only on the other side of the country, but not even in the lower 48. And everything was filed away, but nothing came of it. Basically, Bill and Lorraine's case sat for almost a year. Almost. So he's back in Anchorage by June 16th. And he seems satisfied for now. But it doesn't last long. This is the big one. This is the case that leads to the arrest of Israel Keyes. He makes a series of mistakes. And not only mistakes from being sloppy, but he breaks one of his own rules. He had promised himself that he would never take anybody or kill anybody in the vicinity that he resided in, and he did that. February 1st, 2012, Samantha Koenig, an 18-year-old from Anchorage, Alaska, is working the night shift, about to close up at Common Grounds Kiosk. It's an express coffee place. You kind of just drive up and go. Samantha Tesla Koenig, sometimes called Sammy or Sam, was born in Anchorage, Alaska on August 30th, 1993. Samantha was a Caucasian female, approximately 5'4", about 150 pounds, had brown, sometimes blonde hair, and brown eyes. At the time of her abduction, Sam was wearing a dark-colored jacket, a green shirt with light-colored stripes on the sleeves, a thin dark-colored bracelet, dark-colored pants, and dark-colored shoes. She was believed to be in possession of a carabiner with 3 keys and possibly a white lanyard. She had a medium to large-sized leopard print purse and a black cell phone with sliding keyboard. Israel has been planning this one. He's decided that he's going to break one of his rules. His golden rule, in fact, which is don't murder people where you live. But he decides to. And he made a note that he didn't specifically pick Samantha, but that he knew that in Alaska there are a lot of these express coffee kiosks. Common Grounds is one of them, and that they're usually, it's like a teenage job, and it's usually women as baristas. In the summer, sometimes these baristas will be in bikinis, just hanging out the window, like, come get some coffee, give me a nice tip. Like, it's just kind of a thing. It's a small kiosk, so they're alone. There's a huge window. It's not like, you know, if you go to McDonald's or whatever, they're like, they have a sliding window and it's small. This one is huge. You can jump through it, and he does. So he decides to take that route and stops at Common Grounds. Sam is closing up for the night. It's almost 8 p.m. closing time, and he said he just really liked how she looked. He just liked her. He had already decided, like, this is the person I'm gonna take. Before we get into all of that, I'm gonna eat some more of these, my third one, and read you a little bit about Sam, because I looked up her MySpace. The Internet Archives, the last login that she has on here, or the capture that was taken, was from August 5th, 2010. So she's 16 here, close enough. She was 18 when she unfortunately met Israel. These really are good. Her profile says 16. I don't give a fuck about your age. Anything with an engine sounds like love. Fishing, cussing, and camping is what tickles my fancy. I don't play games nor plan on doing so. I think I'm funny. Don't judge me when I laugh. No one else does. I fucking hate it when people copy me. Crazy motherfucker, I am one. Her interests are listed as such. I love horses, wolves, cat, singular, family, guns, trucks, golf, football, boxing. What did I say? Frolf. Frolf? I don't know what that is. FROLF. Animal Planet, cigarettes, alcohol, and men with goatees, blue eyes, or tattoos. Alright, that's it. So, she also, this is what kills me, it's always the dogs that really touch me. She has the sweetest little pit. Her puppy's name is Sheba. She calls her my little princess. I swear this dog is so cute. Anyway, Sam's just an average 16-year-old. She's got a boyfriend named Dwayne, a cute pit bull named Sheba. She's working at Common Grounds coffee shop. She's just trying to go home for the night. It's almost closing, and one last customer walks up to the window. He's wearing a ski mask, which sounds intimidating and odd, but it's really not. It's so cold up there. I can't imagine not completely covering my face. So, man comes up in a ski mask and hands her his traveler's thermos and asks for an Americano. She's smiling, she's nice, she makes him one. She turns back around to give him his coffee, and he pulls a gun on her and tells her that he's robbing the place. She puts her hands up, and he tells her, turn the lights off, and turn the light for the open sign off. She does both of those things. Israel then tells her to give him all the money in the till. She does as quickly as possible and hands it to him through the window. Then Israel tells her to turn around at the window, and she does. She's been quiet this whole time and compliant. She really, it seems, believes that this is a robbery, like it's gonna be fine. But then she turns around and he cuffs her wrists with zip ties. He has zip tied her wrists together. So he zip ties her wrists behind her back and tells her to step forward. So she does. Then he jumps through the window. Now they start to talk. Israel's asking her all kinds of questions so that he can gather as much information as possible. He asks if she has a car. She says no. He asks who's picking her up. She says her dad is, though I think that it was actually Dwayne who was going to pick her up. He asks if she pressed an emergency button, and she says no. He says, okay, well, I have a police scanner in my car and an earpiece in, so I'll know if you're lying, because I'll hear the call. And she's like, I'm not lying. Then Israel grabs a stack of napkins and stuffs them in Samantha's mouth, telling her, we're going for a walk. Where are they going? They're going to Israel's car, because he parked as far away from any possible security cameras that he could. They're walking to the car, and oddly enough, in the parking lot, Israel says that there is a new Canon camera. Israel sees it and real quick decides he's gonna take it so he can sell it later. But in that split moment when Samantha realizes that he's distracted, she's like, okay, bye. She tries to make a run for it. So Israel tackles her and shoves a gun between her ribs and says, if you try that again, I'm gonna kill you. So he pulls her up and he keeps the gun in her rib cage and tells her to lean on him and act like you're drunk. So it's like, oh, I'm the good boyfriend, I'm taking my drunk girlfriend home. So they finally get to his truck and there are people standing around, and I can't even imagine what she's thinking. Should I say something? He's got a gun on me, there are napkins shoved in my mouth, and he kind of pushes her in the car and buckles her in. You know, her wrists are behind her back. Like, this is a horrible situation to be in. So Israel gets in the car and he tells Sam that he's going to hold her for ransom. He tells her what the deal is, that he is taking her to a holding location, and he starts driving. What she doesn't know is that Kimberly is still awake, so Israel has to kill a little bit of time on the road until he can actually go home. While they're driving, they pull up to a red light, and it turns into a bit of a Twilight Zone situation because right next to them pulls up a cop car with 2 cops in it. The serial killer with an 18-year-old girl who's tied and buckled in, freshly kidnapped, and 2 cops, all just hanging out alone at night on a road with this red sheen just glistening off of the icy Alaskan roads. It's pretty bizarre to think about. My useless commentary aside, Sam is completely frozen. Obviously, she was thinking about her options in this situation, but in the end, she decided to stay put, be quiet, and be cooperative because I think that she believed this would be the best outcome in a kidnapping situation for ransom. I think she really believed, still at this point at least, that she was being kidnapped for ransom. But, you know, we'll never know what she was really thinking. The light turns green and that opportunity is gone. So they're still driving and Israel looks over and notices that Sam is shivering a little bit, and he asks her if she's cold. And she nods yes. So he pulls over and actually puts her in the back and puts blankets over her. One of those weird acts of kindness from a serial killer who just kidnapped you. Very strange. Anyways, Israel gets back in the car and then it dawns on him, shit, I need a phone. Like, I need a phone if I'm doing this ransom. So he thinks, maybe I can buy one. And I think it was a Walmart. He drove to a Walmart, pulled up there and realized, wow, this is like really busy. Then he realizes that Sam's phone is back at Common Grounds. He's like, well, I still got time to kill. So he drives all the way back to Common Grounds coffee shop. And he hadn't locked the door of the kiosk. So he walks in, and this is how sloppy he is getting. When he walks back into the kiosk, he notices that there are a few loose zip ties just lying on the floor. So he collects them, he grabs her phone, then he thinks maybe he should make it look like she locked up, so he locks the door of the kiosk, goes back to the truck, she hasn't tried anything, and they drive back to his place. So they finally get to his house, and Israel quickly goes to double check that Kimberly is sleeping, in fact, and she is. So he brings Sam into the shed. So he finally gets her in there, and the shed has got 2 large heaters, a tarp laid out, and a radio. He gets her in there, gives her a bucket to sit on, and turns the radio all the way up so that if she screams, no one can hear her. He puts on heavy metal music, and for her sake, I hope it wasn't Insane Clown Posse. So Sam is sitting on this bucket, and he wraps a rope around her neck and then screws it into the wall. Then Israel tells Sam that he needs her debit card for the ransom, and she tells him she doesn't have one on her, but she does share one with her boyfriend Dwayne, and it's in the glove compartment of her truck. Now Israel has to go get it. So he gets the address from Sam, she gives him her PIN number, so that he can stop at the ATM and make sure it works on the way back. And he decides to use Kimberly's car to drive over there. So he takes Kimberly's car and parks a ways down the road from the house that Sam's truck is at. He walks over to her truck, opens it, and starts going through her wallet to get the card. And all of a sudden, the front door of the house opens and Dwayne is standing there. This is ridiculous. He's making so many mistakes. Apparently, Dwayne just stares at Israel and then after a moment turns around and runs back inside. I don't know what Dwayne was thinking, but Israel kind of like, okay. He takes the card and goes to the ATM, but then on the way to the ATM, he realizes that he can't remember the PIN number that Sam gave him. So he drives back to the shed, gets it from her, and then goes to the ATM and checks that it works. At this point, there's only a few hours left before the sun's gonna be coming up. So he heads back home. He gets back to the shed, he gives Sam some water, he pours himself a glass of wine, they have a cigarette, and I feel like this probably gave her a little bit of hope. He even cut her zip tie restraints and let her relax a little bit. And then he cuts the rope on her neck. So she's completely unrestrained at this point. And he lays her down and ties her arms behind her back and ties her in an incredibly complicated way. And he rapes her twice. He said that this took about the length of 3 songs on the radio. After this, Sam asked if he was gonna kill her, and she tried to talk him out of it, actually, but he had already made up his mind. He made up his mind a long time ago. He starts strangling her, and it's difficult to strangle someone to death. He said it was taking way too long. It was taking too long. He wanted to speed things up. So he stabbed her once in the back by her right shoulder blade. And Israel goes back inside, takes a shower, then wakes his daughter up and tells her to start getting ready because they're going on vacation. Then he goes back into the shed and rolls Sam's body up in a tarp and stuck her in a cabinet. He then turned all of the heaters off and double padlocked the shed. Then he calls a cab so he and his daughter can go on vacation. This shit happens and he takes his 10-year-old on a fucking cruise. He goes on holiday with his daughter after murdering an 18-year-old girl. Again though, this is part of his MO. Once something happens, he gets the hell out of town the next day. And this lined up perfectly with a Caribbean cruise with his 10-year-old daughter. So for the next 2 weeks, Israel will be nowhere near Anchorage. Samantha was reported missing next day when the morning employee realized that there was no cash in the register and that the shop hadn't been closed up properly. Now, unfortunately, the reaction was defaulted to the fact that Sam was a recovered drug addict and her and Duncan had actually had an argument the day before, which was proven on text messages. So the Anchorage Police Department assumed, hey, she's 18, she stole some cash, she has a history of drug abuse, she's probably relapsed, and her boyfriend are fighting. However, when Dwayne and Samantha's father realized that neither of them had heard from her, they contacted Duncan, who owns Common Grounds. Duncan decides to go and check the surveillance footage of Common Grounds. So they see this guy jumping through the window, and then him and Samantha stand in there and talk for a while. That's probably someone she knows, and it probably has to do with drugs. Sam had used marijuana and had used cocaine a year prior, but had been clean since that time. During interviews with several other friends and acquaintances of Sam's, the fact that she was recovering from a substance abuse problem and that she occasionally relapsed seemed to be a common theme. The documents that the FBI released are frustrating to read because much of the information is blocked out, but the general gist is that someone who was interviewed by the Anchorage PD said that someone in Sam's circles was robbing drug dealers, and that this person observed what he described as a black and gray Smith & Wesson .40 semi-auto pistol tucked in the front of his pants, and that this person was boasting about doing this. Another person interviewed by detectives told them that he knew from relatives that Sam was missing, but didn't believe it was a legitimate abduction. Apparently, this person also thought Sam was off on a cocaine binge. Then the Anchorage Police Department got a warrant to search a crawl space of somebody's house, connected to this in some way. And in the crawl space of that person's apartment, they appeared to be growing marijuana. In the crawl space of the apartment appeared to be a marijuana grow operation that was recently disseminated. In addition to 2 1,000-watt halogen bulbs, there was growing medium, several pots, black plastic, and marijuana shake, or small pieces of discarded marijuana plant material. So, this next theory kind of piggybacks off of the first one, but is a little more sinister. This theory, and again, there are too many words and numbers blocked out to know exactly who they're talking about, but someone in Sam's circle had developed this ruse. What I've derived from this is that there is a drug mule who decided to come up with a ruse to keep one of the packages of weed and then tell the senders that the police had seized it, but that the rest of it was delivered. And within that, someone was being paid to keep it at their house.
He picked up 2 boxes that contained approximately 15 pounds of marijuana.
High quality marijuana that would probably have a street value of about $4,000 per pound.
The ruse was to keep one of the packages from being
her as collateral for
this
payment
unnamed
of the
person was
marijuana.
obviously under the influence of controlled substances. They also had multiple obvious track marks, indicative of drug injection.
When he heard about Samantha,
Lots of boxes of marijuana, 15 pounds of marijuana, New Year's Eve, and ruses and whatever. No one had any inkling about how dark this really was. Their minds weren't even anywhere near that. Most people thought she was either on a drug binge, or if she had been kidnapped and there was some kind of foul play, it didn't lead to her being killed. She was just kidnapped because there was some drug deal gone wrong and she was actually being held for ransom in that regard. Keyes hadn't contacted anyone about ransom, so that's a theory at this point. He wouldn't contact anyone for a couple weeks, not until he came back from his cruise.
I want to ask for her captors if they would please send my daughter home. I will give you anything in this world. Call me anonymously. You don't have to go through the police. I will meet you. I will give you whatever you want. Just please bring my daughter back. Not good. I don't think any of us are holding up in this. I don't know if my daughter's being fed, taken care of, if she's still alive, if she's getting any sleep. I don't think any of us are.
Tell us about Samantha. What's she like? We don't know her.
She's one of the sweetest girls you'll ever know. She's got the biggest heart. She's funny. She's sarcastic. I mean, every girl that knows her calls her best friend.
She's very
I mean, people on the internet are slandering my daughter's name, saying she's a prostitute, a drug addict, and all sorts of crap. And she is the furthest thing from that. And I won't put up with it anymore. And the people watching this that are putting that shit on TV, excuse my language, I'm going to send it to the cyber unit of the Anchorage Police Department, and you will be prosecuted for slandering my daughter's name.
It's sad that everybody assumed she was on a drug binge. I can understand that, but it's sad. And also good for her for staying clean. Samantha was dead within 10 hours of her abduction, and the Anchorage Police Department wasn't even able to review the footage from Common Ground's security cameras until about 24 hours after her abduction. So, I mean, they were just way behind on this. Israel is not done killing. Oh no. February 15th, 2012, James Lamar Tidwell, aka Jimmy, goes missing after work. He's a 58-year-old Caucasian male, married with 2 kids, who are now full-grown adults. Jimmy was last seen 2 hours outside of Dallas in Longview, where he worked the night shift as an electrician. He'd been working there for 10 years. He left work at 5:30 a.m. and then disappeared. Was never seen again. Tidwell had long, wavy, chestnut brown hair and a white hard hat, which he was often seen in. His Ford pickup truck was found 5 miles from his house. His glasses were in the car, but his cell phone, wallet, and keys were gone. Israel wouldn't confess to this one, but the conversation surrounding it was suspicious. The FBI believes that this fits his MO, and also that Jimmy is Israel's 4th confirmed victim, short of Israel's confession. The very next day, February 16th, in Aledo, Texas, Keyes burglarized and burned a house down. He says that he set the fire as a distraction so that he could go rob a bank. You know, it's a small town, having almost all of the resources focused on putting a fire out, having the news there, the police, a bank would be a sitting duck. It wasn't a bad plan, but Keyes lost track of time, standing up on a hill watching all of the chaos that he created unfold, and basically wasn't able to make his window of opportunity to rob the bank. But no matter, because Israel just picked another bank 30 miles away in a different town. Agents confirmed the arson, and media reports indicated the 3,500 square foot home was completely lost in the fire. Keyes 100% admitted to this. The way that he confessed to this one was later in an interrogation. Keyes said, "If you want, I can give you an arson in Texas. I burned a house down, but I want a cigar for it." He built houses, but he also burned them down. He also took some jewelry from the home before he set it on fire. Keyes indicated he brought the jewelry back to Alaska and placed it in a fanny pack in his residence at 2425 Spur Lane. This jewelry has not yet been recovered. February 16th, he robbed a bank in Azle, Texas. And he got away with about $10,000. This part is so creepy. In the security footage, Israel can be seen with long, wavy, chestnut brown hair wearing a white hard hat. The same as Jimmy Tidwell's. Israel's hair was short at the time. Did he scalp the guy? Investigators asked him, "Where do you buy real hair, Israel?" And Israel said, "You don't have to buy real hair to get real hair." Then he laughed and said,
"Everything's free if you take it."
Comment below what you're eating, I want to know. Okay, so Israel gets back from his vacation. When he's finally back, it takes him a couple of days of getting settled back in, waiting for the school week to start, so his daughter's gone during the day, to get out to the shed and attend to Samantha's body. Israel's like, "Well, I still want that ransom. I wasn't kidding about that, so I need to be able to take a picture of her and make her look alive." And he gets out there and, I mean, she's completely frozen. It's why he wasn't worried about her body, because it's so cold out there. He just turned the heaters off and like she was fully preserved. So he has set the task for himself to thaw a frozen human body out, which he does using a hairdryer. He takes Sam out of the cupboard, rolls her out. The tarp, by the way, is soaked completely in blood. So he rolls that out. He then thaws her out with a hairdryer, and because, in his words, she was warm, he decided to have sex with her. He props her up and begins applying thick layers of makeup on her to give her face color and a lively look. He then braids her hair, you know, as he learned to do when he was younger, braiding his sister's hair and then his daughter's hair. Then he tries to super glue her eyes open, but the super glue's not working. So he comes up with another idea. He decides to sew them open. To do this, he uses a curved needle and some fishing line. That is horrifying. Then he puts duct tape over her mouth because her face is drooping so much with a loss of elasticity. The only way to really conceal it is with duct tape. The tape helps hold her face up a little bit. Then he holds up an Anchorage daily newspaper from a few days before, specifically from a few days before because he was not in Alaska, he was still on his cruise. So it not only gives him an alibi, but it's recent enough to make a believable ransom picture. So he holds that up next to her face and takes the Polaroid picture. The actual picture of Sam has never been released to the public, but Dark Minds did a reenactment of it, and this is what they came up with. He then scans the picture so as not to give them the original Polaroid, has more evidence on it. The scan will, by nature, lower the quality a little bit. He can manipulate the image better. And then he uses a typewriter that he got to write the ransom note. It's taken him a few days to get to this point. It's been about 3 weeks since Sam was abducted. He's got the picture, he's got the ransom note. Now he just needs to decide where to put it. Once he has all of this together, he sends a text from Sam's phone that says, "Connor Park sign under pic of Albert, ain't she purty?" There's a picture of a missing dog, and his name is Albert. This is the first word that anyone is hearing about Sam since her abduction 3 weeks before. So when they get this, everyone is at that park as soon as possible. And under the picture of Albert, right where the text said it would be, was the ransom note with the scanned picture of Sam. So the ransom note demands $30,000 be put on Sam's debit card and comes with the proof of life picture where Sam is looking wide-eyed straight at the camera with makeup on and her hair braided, and an Anchorage daily newspaper from February 13th, 2012. The note specifically said, "I may not use the card much in AK due to small pop, but as I will be leaving soon, I will be using it all over." The note further gave indication that Samantha had been moved from Alaska, stating that she did almost get away twice, once on Tudor Road and once in the desert. "Must be losing my touch." On the other side of the ransom note included the 16-digit card number for the debit card that belonged to Dwayne, the one he and Sam shared. One of the investigators looked at the photo and actually said, "Samantha's dead." He didn't believe that she was alive. There was a lot of controversy surrounding this, wherein people actually suspected that she might be dead, but no one was for sure, and to be honest, I think most people wanted to believe that she was still alive, and they did. There was so much back and forth on this that they actually called in an expert in snuff films for a kind of diagnosis, if you will, and even that person said that they weren't sure if she was alive or not. So the $30,000 goes into the bank account. They don't know anything about this man. They don't know what car he's driving, if Sam knows him, if Sam's even alive. All they can do is wait for Samantha's kidnapper to use the debit card so that they can track it. So there are a couple pings that they get from an ATM somewhere in Alaska, but by the time they get there, like, this person is long gone. Then, all of a sudden, Alaska, Wilcox, Arizona. The card starts pinging in the lower 48. So because of a daily limit on an ATM card, Keyes can only withdraw $500 a day. He would take cash out late at night in one state and then cross the border and just after midnight, technically the next day, take another $500 out. So 2 withdrawals in Alaska, then 1 withdrawal in Wilcox, Arizona, and then another one in Lordsburg, New Mexico. Then Humble, Texas. So the next hit the FBI gets from Sam's card is in Humble, Texas. This is a big mistake. When he withdraws $500 from the ATM in Humble, Texas, you can see his rental car in the back. There's a white Ford Focus behind him that is captured from the ATM security camera. And with that detail, he's fucked. This was tough for FBI agents in Anchorage because they were relying on law enforcement elsewhere. So they sent out a BOLO, a be on the lookout, that the FBI is looking for a middle-aged white man who seems tall and who is driving a white Ford Focus. So Israel is driving one of the most commonly rented vehicles in the United States, in the second largest state in the US, the first being Alaska. So this is very vague and very little information to go on. Then he went to his sister's wedding in, I believe, Wells, Texas, where a bunch of his family members tried to convert him back to believing in God, and he had a bit of an outburst, telling them, "Not everyone has the same morals as you." They sure don't. March 13th, 2012. Texas Ranger Steve Rayburn gets the Be on the Lookout email and passes all that information along to his team. So Israel wakes up, gets ready for his day, yada yada yada, walks out of his hotel in Texas, gets in his white Ford Focus, pulls out of the parking lot. Israel was just about to turn onto a route that would lead to an interstate when veteran Corporal Brian Henry pulls him over. Israel had been going slightly over the speed limit, perfect opportunity. He gets pulled over and he's like sweating. Israel was not prepared for this. He was so unprepared that he didn't even have his gun with him. He left it either in the trunk or in the back seat. Brian Henry asks him where he's from. Israel's like, Alaska. Brian Henry said, "In 22 years of traffic stops, I have never pulled anyone over from Alaska." And in that moment, when he told me he was from Alaska, I knew it was him. I just knew it. And like, no one knew Israel's name. They didn't know anything about him, but they're about to. An FBI agent named Deb Ganaway had reviewed the bolo and actually had headed to Steve Rayburn's office before all of the stuff went down. So when Israel was pulled over, there was an FBI agent there who was able to actually go out and observe all of this stuff that was happening and point out all of the things that were in his car. And it's like Israel was trying to get caught. It's like he wasn't even trying to hide anything, though I think that he really just was like so out of control that he thought he wasn't going to get caught, because he had physical maps from multiple different states that he'd highlighted. There were rolls of cash in the passenger side door that had been tagged with dye packs. There were white tennis shoes in the car, and Deb pointed out that though white tennis shoes are not particularly unique, that the perp who had been taking money out of the debit card was wearing white tennis shoes. That was captured in the ATM video footage. In the trunk of the car, they found transgender pornography, a skull cap ski mask, and Sam's cell phone that had been disassembled with the batteries taken out, and they found her ATM card in his wallet. Israel told them that he and his daughter had flown from Anchorage to Las Vegas because they couldn't get a direct flight to Texas because it was like last minute, and that his sister was having a wedding there, and he had decided that he wanted to take his daughter to see the Grand Canyon, which is why they were driving all over before they got to Texas. In regards to the items that he was carrying with him, he said some stranger threw them in his car, and that's how he came to be in possession of them. Israel's arrested, taken to jail in Texas, interrogated, but the interrogations yielded nothing. He wouldn't talk. He was like pissed because he didn't have his gun with him. Israel had plans that if he ever got caught, he was going to go out with a bang, and he was going to end up either shooting himself after killing a bunch of cops, or in a big shootout, the cops were going to kill him. It was going to be a whole thing. But none of that happened, and I think he was mad.
Agent Debra Ganaway responded to the Quality and Suites, at which time she conducted a walk-by and visual inspection of the white Ford Focus. She noted the barcode sticker on the driver's side back passenger window, consistent with the stickers applied to rental vehicles. Agent Ganaway also noted numerous items of clothing, trash, and other debris in plain sight within the vehicle, including what appeared to be a girl's or woman's pink item of clothing. Ganaway had obtained an in-house list of all occupants from the front desk manager of the Quality and Suites, which revealed that room 215 was rented by Elijah Keyes, Israel's brother. Meanwhile, in Alaska, now that the Anchorage Police Department had a name,
Detectives discovered that Keyes listed a residential address of 2456 Spur Lane in Anchorage, Alaska. So that very day, March 13th, 2012, members of the Anchorage Police Department Special Assignment Unit went to Israel's house. No one answered repeated knocks on the door. And this is when they discovered Israel's truck. The white Chevrolet pickup truck was parked in the driveway of the address. The truck had a large toolbox in the bed and a ladder rack on top. They ran the license plate of the white 2004 Chevrolet Silverado, which was, of course, registered to Israel Keyes. They quickly concluded that the truck appeared to match the vehicle appearing in the Home Depot surveillance footage. The vehicle appeared to be an exact match with one exception. The 2004 Chevrolet Silverado belonging to Keyes was equipped with a large removable toolbox in its bed. The toolbox was emblazoned with the phone number of Keyes Construction Company. Investigators sought to establish whether the toolbox was present on the Chevrolet on February 1st, 2012. The first person they interviewed was Israel's daughter. At the time, Lainey was 10 years old, and she informed investigators that she noticed on or about the 1st of February that the toolbox had been removed from her father's truck, and she stated that this was unusual. She also said that she had discussed the removal of the toolbox around that time with a neighbor and playmate known as A.B. Pursuant to this information, investigators, of course, questioned her friend, who confirmed that the toolbox had not only been removed around this time, but that it was unusual, and that shortly after, the toolbox had been replaced on the truck. She also confirmed that Israel's daughter had in fact discussed this observation contemporaneously with its occurrence.
Now the FBI has Israel Keyes in front of them, and they don't know shit about Izzy. Before Samantha Koenig, law enforcement had no knowledge of Israel, and everyone else just thought he was this nice guy who lived with his wife Kimberly and his daughter in this nice neighborhood, totally upstanding, trustworthy guy, running his own construction business, and like a bunch of judges and lawyers lived in this neighborhood in Anchorage. So the only way that they're gonna figure this out is if they get a warrant to search his house. And they do. They confiscate his computers and Kimberly's computers.
On the 13th of March 2012, the Anchorage PD obtained a state of Alaska search warrant for Israel's house, the residence located at 2456 Spur Lane. Evidence seized included, but was not limited to, trace evidence, DNA swabs from door handles, cameras, duct tape, computers, various media cards, cell phones, linens, knives, and miscellaneous paperwork. The APD searched the residence at this time for evidence related to the kidnapping and murder of Samantha Koenig. The very next day, Kimberly was interviewed, and she indicated that Israel owned a laptop computer and that this computer was not at the residence. But no matter, because a few days later, on March 16th, law enforcement in Beaumont, Texas, obtained a warrant to search the white Ford Focus. The execution of that search warrant took place the next day, March 17th, and revealed numerous items, including Samantha Koenig's phone and Israel's Lenovo B570 laptop. The following day, on March 27th, 2012, Israel Keyes was transported to Anchorage, Alaska, and arraigned on one count of access device fraud.
Keyes now knows. He's like, all right, this is it. They got my stuff. So he starts figuring out, like trying to remember what is on his computer, and decides that he's only going to tell them about things that he knows they're already gonna find out about. They like sit him down and tell him, we can see that you, on your computer, you've been searching for news on Samantha Koenig, and despite Keyes' efforts to avoid security cameras, he can be seen walking with Sam away from Common Grounds, and Home Depot on another side of that parking lot plaza area got footage of his white pickup truck. Israel was basically like, well, I mean, I guess I should tell you about it. I also had her ATM card, like, I should just tell you. Remember, at this point, they still don't even know if she's alive. First thing Israel does is confirm, yeah, she's dead. I killed her. And then they want to know how and where her body is. So he tells them that he's gonna need a few things first. He wants some peanut butter Snickers bars, he wants some Americano coffee, and he wants a wild and mild cigar. And he wants to make sure that his name is not leaked to the press because he doesn't want his 10-year-old daughter hearing about this stuff. So they're like, yeah, okay, fine. The interrogator said that when he would start talking about his victims, his voice would get low and chilling. I don't want to make it sound, oh, he'd go into this trance like he was back there, back at the shed. But that's really kind of the way that he came across to them. You know, he's bound. He has a chain around his waist and his hands are cuffed to it. And he would start to bounce his knees, which would make his chains jingle. And he would start rubbing his back on the chair. It's really weird, but it did tell them that, yes, he is a sexually motivated killer. This is his weird expression of that. And also, every time he would go into that kind of state and start doing that, like rubbing his legs and stuff, they would know that what he was saying was true. So Israel tells them all the details of what he did to Samantha in this low, chilling, creepy fucking voice. Then he tells them that her body is at the bottom of the Matanuska Lake. So now they've got a serious task at hand. They have to corroborate what he said by finding her remains. So back in his shed, he had cut her up into 5 pieces, arms, legs, torso, and put her in different bags. He had to make multiple trips to the lake. He like triple bagged these to make sure that nothing leaked. He goes out to the lake and builds himself a little hide. He has to cut into the lake so that he can build a hole to dump this into. And the hides are quite common with ice fishing in Alaska because it's so cold when you're out there for hours. Disposed of her body parts in the lake in 5 pieces that were all unwrapped, and he had attached weights to them with wires. And sorry, I'm laughing because he actually goes fishing, and he does this 2 days in a row. And after he catches fish, he takes it home and cooks it for dinner for his wife and daughter, or live-in girlfriend, whatever Kimberly was.
Shortly after this, on the 30th of March, Israel gave the FBI consent to seize and search the white and green shed. He also provided agents with the location of tools he used to dismember Samantha and items he used to move her body to Matanuska Lake. Israel advised there was likely some blood evidence on the walls and floors of the shed and on the tools. Agents from the Anchorage FBI seized the shed on March 30th and searched the contents of the shed on the 31st. Numerous items were seized from the shed. Presumptive blood tests were done on stains on the walls of the shed and stains found on some of the items removed from the shed. Presumptive tests were positive for stains on the rear wall of the shed, green rope, and a garden sprayer that was in the shed. Many of these items have been sent to the FBI laboratory for examination. Following this would be the discovery of Samantha's body. On April 2nd, 2012, the FBI Underwater Search Response Team discovered Samantha's remains in Lake Matanuska at the precise location identified by Keyes.
They were about 45 feet underwater, and 2 divers had to go down there and get all the body parts, and they were under the water for over an hour.
At Matanuska Lake Monday afternoon, a worst-case scenario showed up just outside Kevin Sturgeon's house.
I just thought people were ice fishing. That's all I thought. I had no idea intentions on what was going on.
All of the details of this are incredible. They actually have to build a separate hide when they take the body parts out because there's like a helicopter around and there's news. People have gathered to watch and like see what was going on. It was pretty chaotic.
Samantha's remains were transported to the State of Alaska Medical Examiner's Office for a forensics exam and autopsy.
And it's not even over yet. They don't even know about Bill and Lorraine. This is barely scratching the surface. So they sit back down with Keyes and they're like, all right, what else? I'm getting tired of all the Snickers. Whoa. So I got some sushi and soda. So the interrogations continue. And Israel's like, I want the New York Times delivered to my cell every morning. Again, keep my name out of the press. I don't want details of what I did to Sam being released. I want an execution date. I don't want to sit in this cell forever. I want an execution date. Or I'll do it myself. And I want my Wild and Mild cigars, and I want my Americano, and I want my peanut butter Snickers bar.
I want this whole thing done in a year. From today. Start to finish, basically. If I can't get an execution date within a year, You know, I'll tell you about everything. I'll give you plead guilty to whatever. I'll give you every single gory detail you want. But that's what I want, because I want my kid to have a chance to grow up. You know, she's in a safe place now. She's not going to see any of this. I want her to have a chance to grow up and not have all this hanging over her head. She's going to be fine, but I don't want, you know, and if I end up in in prison for, you know, who knows how many years, 10, 20 years down the road, I know how this works. You're going to keep looking, you're going to keep going back, talking to everybody I've ever been with, you know, from the time I was 20 years old or whatever, and I don't want stuff to keep popping up on the news about me, you know. But I know that if I have an execution date, which frankly, you know, I already talked to my attorney about this. There's no jury.
Don't tell me what you talked to him about.
There's no jury. Okay, I'm talking to you about this. There's no jury in the world or in America that is, if I went to trial on these and got convicted, there's no jury in the U.S. that would not vote for the death penalty for me. I already know that.
Basically, they tell him, look, dude, we can't pull all of these strings for you. You have to give us more. You got to give us more information. So he's like, I'll give you 2 bodies and a name, but I want a cigar for it. Anyways, he gives them Bill and Lorraine Currier and tells them all the stuff that happened, that he took them to the farmhouse. I think it was at 32 Upper Main Street in Essex, Vermont. Remember when Israel was like, I don't have time to burn this farmhouse down? It probably won't matter, because if anyone buys this, they're just gonna demolish it. Like, this house is worthless. Well, he was right. So they get a big screen and they pull up a map. They take Israel into a room and have him point out where he took Bill and Lorraine Currier. In April 2012, Albany Division received information from Anchorage Division that Bill and Lorraine Currier were murdered in June 2011, and their bodies were left in an abandoned farmhouse in Essex, Vermont. Investigators revealed that the abandoned farmhouse was demolished at the end of October 2011. Unfortunately, this played out exactly how Israel said it would. Some people came in and they got like a whiff of just rot and decay. It smelled like dead bodies. They thought maybe an animal had got into the basement or something, and they were like, oh, I'm not going down there. Whatever, just tear the whole thing down. When the farmhouse was demolished, the basement of the farmhouse was filled in with the stone walls of the house. So all that's left there is a lot. Nothing's been built over it yet. So the FBI decides to dig and see if they can find anything where the basement used to be. In April 2012, investigators dug out the basement and sifted the contents. However, the Currier's remains were not recovered.
Detectives were digging into the foundation of an abandoned home that was recently demolished. They were looking for evidence that may lead them to Bill and Lorraine Currier. The Essex couple vanished last June. Police call them crime victims, but they still haven't been found, and detectives have revealed almost nothing.
They find nothing. So then things get really crazy. Where did all of the material from the house go? Investigation further determined that demolition debris was taken to the all-cycle transfer station in Williston, Vermont, where it was then transported to the Coventry landfill in Newport, Vermont. Investigation at this point led to the Coventry landfill, and end up spending a huge amount of resources going through the landfill to try and find Bill and Lorraine Currier's remains.
Earlier today, we went for a flight over the landfill to try to get a glimpse of exactly what kind of work is going on here. And as you can see from these pictures, there was a fleet of police vehicles there in the landfill. They were looking for clues that could help unravel that mystery of what happened to Bill and Lorraine Currier. The Essex couple has been missing now for 11 months, last seen on their jobs in the Burlington area. We don't know exactly why police zeroed in on this Casella landfill. They have been, of course, very, very tight-lipped about their investigation, saying that they don't want to reveal too much about it because they don't want to endanger this very delicate case. But we do know that the work today is a follow-up to a dig last month at a demolished home on Route 15 in Essex. Federal authorities told us that today. They also said that the searching here in Coventry could stretch on for between 1 and 3 weeks.
The search that was conducted at the Coventry landfill was from May 7th of 2012 to July 20th of 2012. The search focused on an area of trash placement on October 16th, 2011 and October 27th of 2011, which is when the house was taken down. When they told Israel about this and the cost and the manpower and the time that was put into this, he laughed and said, "Oh wow, that's a lot. I almost feel guilty." Like, fuck you, dude. Investigators were unable to locate the remains of Bill and Lorraine Currier. I really hate that he was right. At this point, they're starting to put together this guy's modus operandi and realizing that it's terrifying. He would buy a one-way ticket into a major hub, board a flight, turn his cell phone off, and take the battery out. And from then on out, he would only use cash. At his destination, he would rent a car and drive hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles to a kill kit that he had buried sometimes years beforehand. These kill kits were 5-gallon Home Depot buckets that were filled with guns, zip ties, ammunition, rope, duct tape, flashlights, batteries, maps, cash from previous bank robberies, and Drano to help the process of human decomposition. And then he would hunt. He had at least 5 kill kits buried in New York, Alaska, Wyoming, Vermont, and Texas. The thing that was fascinating about Keyes was that he didn't seem to have a victim profile. He would go after men and women of any age, any ethnicity. Sometimes he would just abduct one of them, sometimes he would take 2 people. In this way, investigators learned that Israel was bisexual. Not that that narrows down his victim profile at all, but it does offer some more insight into Israel as a person. Israel might abduct somebody in the daylight, or maybe sneak into their house at night and take them. He would always take them to another location where he would torture, rape, and kill them, and then he would take them to yet a third location where he would dispose of the body, preferably across state lines. Then he would get back in his car and drive hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles to put as much distance in between the crime scene and himself as quickly as possible. Sometimes, but not always, he would commit crimes right after his murders, like arson or bank robbery. Up until this point, Israel has been a pretty easy prisoner. His first 70 days of incarceration have gone, as smooth as they can. Until the 71st day. Israel's in court and tries to make an escape attempt. Israel was able to unlock his restraints by taking a piece of plastic wrap from a sandwich and creating a little tool out of it to get the lock loose. Then he stuck one end of the cuff in his sock and nobody noticed. In the middle of court, he jumps over the dais. The whole courtroom is filled with US Marshals. There's a judge there. He basically got a couple steps before a US Marshal punched him in the face. Despite getting punched in the face, though, he didn't go down. He was actually able to move another meter before 3 more marshals were on him and had tackled him to the ground.
Filed shortly after the court issued the order in this matter setting today's hearing. Our position is that at this particular juncture, we're not...
Judge, can we go ahead and clear the courtroom? Can we go ahead and just clear the courtroom for now? Make sure you get all your stuff.
The investigators on his case said that he was incredibly strong and that it was weird to see this happen, to have this big marshal punch him in the face and have Keyes he's still moving forward. He was a very powerful human. He ran a lot, he did marathons, he lifted weights, he did manual labor for a living, all of his construction work. Israel talked to investigators about all kinds of weird plans that he had for different weapons and different people and building bombs and such. Anyways, in regards to his escape attempt, he talked with interrogators about this in their next meeting.
The first thing I got to tell you, Israel, we talked about a little bit earlier, that stunt yesterday in the courtroom did not go over well. With a lot of folks, not the least of which were the prosecutors. And that was the delay actually getting in here is we knew you had some legal questions, and so we reached out for him to say, hey, Israel says he's got some questions, are you guys available to speak to him? And I couldn't even get one of them was in court, the other one said, basically, what the fuck, after yesterday. So they didn't think that was too funny. And why are they afraid I'd actually get away? that wasn't embarrassing for them, I guess. No, it's, I don't think that they were looking at it from that perspective. Lawyers just don't like excitement, that's all it is.
Israel said, the bottom line is, everybody sitting in this room wants the same thing. You all want the information I can give you. I want to give you all the information I can reasonably give you. You want me to be punished, and I want to be punished. I'd like to try and make it happen because that'll make it easier on everybody. I'm not a patient person. I don't think I've ever lived anywhere for more than 5 or 6 years. I get bored easily. So you can see why sitting in a jail year after year waiting for this stuff to resolve is not really attractive to me.
He was told in response that the more bodies you give us, the more likely it is that that's gonna happen for you. And Izzy was like, no. You make it happen for me. And then I'll tell you everything you want to know. So this was actually like in the works. They're like, okay, Mr. Keys, we'll get you that execution date, but you have to do a psych evaluation. So Israel did. His psych evaluation was actually some of what Maureen Callahan was able to obtain in her lawsuit. Israel's profile really isn't all that surprising. He has higher than average intelligence. He suffers from cluster B personality disorder, that being antisocial personality. He has characteristics of both primary and secondary psychopathy. He's manipulative, he lacks remorse, he lacks empathy. He gets bored easily, so he's excitement seeking. He has criminal versatility and does not take responsibility for his actions. Israel also took pride in these awful things that he did. Hurting humans, hurting animals, starting fires, lying, stealing. Israel is motivated by his sexual desires and by domination and control. Israel told investigators that John Douglas's Mindhunter and Roy Hazelwood's Dark Dreams had a big impact on him and taught him that he wasn't alone. Definitely read books about Ted Bundy. Israel was studying his techniques and the events and mistakes that led to Bundy's arrest. He also read how Bundy escaped both times and how he was captured again. Israel said, my entire goal was to stay under the radar. For a lot of stuff, I couldn't even find the stories. There wasn't anything. All I can say is that unless I talk about it, you're never going to find any evidence. The more you investigate me on the crimes that I'm confessing to, you're going to find that if I wasn't talking about those, you wouldn't have much evidence. Someone who interviewed him actually said, Israel has secrets within secrets. So investigators learned a little about Israel, and now they had murder confessions for 3 victims. But after he confessed to Bill and Lorraine Currier, Israel kind of backed off. He didn't want to talk anymore.
That's been sitting in the refrigerator for the... Thank you. Well, here's the thing, the FBI's been cleaning out the refrigerator. You're going to be suspicious of us, we're going to be suspicious of you, but frankly, when we sat down in this room, everyone here tried to play straight with you. Once you stop telling us significant information about other crimes, then these guys couldn't control what the rest of the FBI is going to do. And the playbook says, if you've got a serial killer, you're going to have to go through that house. Right? They're going to do it. And the only way to hold that off is to say, well, look, he's cooperating, he's giving us information, but when you stop, then there's going to be consequences that you're not being forthcoming.
Right.
And we can be advocates for how we want to pursue this case, but we need something we need material, we need currency, we need something to advocate with. And that's what that's exactly what we've told you for the last 6 months or more.
Yeah, I understand that.
clearly the whole situation is going to turn into longer term than I anticipated, even from my perspective. I guess what I'm saying is, that from my perspective at this point, it's a one-way street, and initially I thought there were ways that I could manipulate this situation in this case, all the related cases, to my benefit and on my timeline by withholding information and giving information out. And obviously, over the last few months, I came to the realization that I can't do that, not realistically. So, is that a real reasoning? Yeah.
The things I've done, and I didn't do them because I don't feel bad about them, and I didn't do them because I felt I had no other choice. I did them for myself, so it's just as good. It's better actually for me to keep them to myself because they're mine, and so unless I'm going to get something in return aside from just an ego boost by talking about them, then I'm not going to talk about them. I don't have any interest in it.
On December 2nd, 2012, at the Anchorage Correctional Complex, Israel Keyes committed suicide by exsanguination. He was able to get a razor, which he stuck in a pencil, and used that to slash open his arms. Left behind were also some milk cartons and a bin to catch the blood so that it wouldn't pool under the door and alert anybody that he was trying to kill himself. To ensure his death, Israel wrapped a bed sheet around his neck and then secured it to his foot. There was actually a note on his door that said, "Do not give this man a razor," but I guess it wasn't taken seriously.
He wanted the death penalty and he wanted it fast. It was, speaking generally, that was what he wanted. There were little things along the way that he wanted, he wanted evidence returned to family members and things like that. But big picture, what he wanted to avoid trials, he wanted to avoid publicity in media, he wanted to avoid being taken from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and tried in multiple places. And ultimately, he wanted the death penalty, and he wanted it quickly. He didn't want to sit in jail for a long period of time.
Israel had written a suicide note, which was more like an exhaustive poem. I'll read it in a separate video. When Tammie found out that he killed himself, she said that she wasn't so much surprised that he committed suicide, but more that she was surprised that he didn't do it sooner, because Israel wasn't the kind of person who could be caged. When asked about her son, Heidi said that Israel was evil. Yeah, no shit. They had a service for him nonetheless. Elder Gardner of the Church of Wells that's based in Texas is the one who did the funeral sermon for Israel in Deer Park, Washington. Now this is the same elder or pastor, whatever, who performed the marriage for Israel's sister. Remember that wedding he went to right before he got arrested? That's the guy who did the wedding. That's the guy who was talking about how atheists are awful and Israel got up in his face because his whole family and the church were trying to proselytize to him for the umpteenth time, and he yelled and was drunk and went off outside to pout and smoke some cigarettes. They didn't get along, so that was kind of like a ironic twist to all this. Anyways, Elder Jacob Gardner called this sermon the funeral of a serial killer.
Israel Keyes, I can imagine his conscience, the conflict in his conscience, this second person who he always had been, but who no one ever knew. This second person inside of him, the murderer, the serial killer, the robber, this man. I can imagine the conflict of conscience in this year and a half as God is striving with him. Israel Keyes, the last days of his life, sitting in his concrete paradise, as he called it in a letter. His concrete paradise. If you can imagine him joking in such state as he is, on the brink of a suicide, not just physical suicide, but eternal suicide. He's joking about his concrete prison and just passing the time with crossword puzzles. That's what he wrote to one of his sisters. Just passing the time with crossword puzzles. This man now is in an eternity of torment. And he spent the last hours of his life numb in front of a book, numb working on a crossword puzzle. Vanity of vanities.
You can go listen to it on their website, though I wouldn't recommend it. It's pretty awful. It is not enjoyable to listen to, like, at all. I'll just say that much, but the link will be in the description, so knock yourself out. After Israel's death, paintings were found under his bed. There were 12 individual sheets of paper. 11 of these had skulls painted on them, and the 12th had a satanic Baphomet pentagram on it. It's assumed that the 11 skulls represent his victims, and the 12th image represents himself and taking his own life.
We believe there are 11 victims total, and that is based primarily on what Keys told us. He was evasive, like you mentioned. He was very evasive at times during interviews, and he told us when we tried to pin him down on a number, he would say it was less than 12. But then there were things that he would say that led us to believe that by less than 12 he simply meant 11, and so he was quick to correct us in interviews if we had something wrong. So there were several times where we just threw out statements like you are 11 victims or things like that, and he didn't correct us. So based on that and some just additional things that he said, we believe the number is 11.
One of the 11 skull paintings, the words "We are one" are scrawled underneath it. I immediately thought of this weird case in Mindhunter, the Sherry Faye Smith case, wherein her abductor and killer called her family and cryptically said, "We are one." He had also killed Sherry while still leading her family to believe that he was holding her for ransom. And he also had sex with her dead body. I don't know if these are connected, but it definitely rang a bell in my mind. Israel said Mindhunter had a big impact on him. There really are only 4 victims that we can be sure of. Sam, Bill, Lorraine, and Jimmy. Maybe he did only kill 11 people, but I think that there were more for sure. Also, he had scrawled the word Belize in blood on his cell wall, so it's quite possible that he took someone in Belize on his trips there. Another interesting thing is that Tammie asked investigators, one of the last things that she brought up to them, they're like, "Hey, do you have any other questions?" And she said, "Yeah, did he kill those 2 girls in Colville?" She's talking about Julia and Cassandra. The mother of his child suspects something like that. I don't know, man. There is just so much information in this case, I couldn't possibly include all of it. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you're interested, I have notes and also my sources in the description of this video. I'm Victoria Evans. Stay safe out there.
You're not going to eat this?
No, I'm good, thank you.
For sure.
Yeah, I'm sure.